So what I thought it would be helpful, let me spend a couple of minutes at the beginning. I don't want to force you to all go back and do laboratory work, but just to show you, why we came to the conclusions that we did. I had a very standard, very classical scientific upbringing. I graduated from the California Institute of Technology, where there were over 20 Nobel laureates. I worked at MIT. So I was exposed to some of the most outstanding scientists in the world and worked in their laboratories, including, as I mentioned, Dr. Prusiner, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize. And so we were interested in my laboratory, and we published over 220 peer-reviewed papers. We were interested in what is the fundamental nature of the neurodegenerative process? Why does this thing happen? In a word, what is Alzheimer's in its most fundamental nature? And as I'll show you today, the research really suggested a very specific model of what this disease actually is. And as I mentioned in the first book, it tells you a lot. It tells you where it came from. It tells you what to do about it. It tells you how to prevent it. It tells you how to reverse it, at least to a point. And yes, we're still wrestling with people who are very far along, but my hope is nobody will wait to get very far along. And that's one of the things I thought we'd talk about today. So there's a tremendous amount that we can all do. And the reality is, with everything that we know, and I'll show you the results of our new trial that we just posted recently, this is an option. Nobody needs to get this disease. The problem is that people wait and wait and wait, and their doctors try to treat it with a single drug, which just actually makes no biological sense. That's the problem. So if we can get people to come in earlier, things will be much, much better. So let me show you a little bit about the research that we're doing and why we're doing it. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to collapse this down a little so we can see a little better. There we go. All right, so first of all, I just want to mention a word about the semantics of success in Alzheimer's disease. And I say this because everybody probably heard that on June 7th, the FDA in the United States approved the new drug called Aduhelm. It's aducanumab is the non-trade name for it. And so this is an antibody that removes amyloid. And I'm going to show you why that doesn't actually make sense. But what they said was this is a win. Of course, subsequently, multiple people who reviewed it quit because in protest to this, because in fact, the panel of 11 experts that had been brought together by the FDA all voted not to approve the drug, and yet the FDA still approved it. So there were some strange things going on behind. In fact, now the Congress has initiated an investigation into why this was approved when really the data didn't suggest that. But here's the best case scenario. So if you're someone who has so-called mild cognitive impairment, which is pre-Alzheimer's, or if you have Alzheimer's, on average, and this has been published a number of times, on average, you lose nearly 3.5 points on a 30-point scale, whether you use MoCA scores or MMSE, which is the mini mental state. You lose about that much per year. In the best case scenario, what aducanumab did was to slow that. It didn't make people better. It didn't stabilize them, but it slowed the decline by 22%, so a little more than a fifth. So not much of an effect. What I'll show you today was a trial that we finished, and we actually had patients who had similar degrees of impairment to those in the aducanumab trial. And ours didn't just slow their decline, it actually made them better. So it's important to distinguish between making someone better and just slowing the decline a little bit. Okay. So here's the problem, and just to put this in perspective, we're all dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic, and as I'll show you, there are actually a lot of correlations between what's going on with COVID-19 and what's going on with Alzheimer's. But for perspective, the Alzheimer's pandemic is much, much larger than the COVID-19 pandemic. Hard to believe. Of course, it's much slower, but in fact, it's much larger. So for example, here in the United States, over 600,000 people have now died of COVID-19. but about 45 million people in the currently living United States citizens will die of this disease if we don't do something about it. So really it dwarfs the COVID-19 pandemic. The big problem is that with COVID-19, we understand the virus. Of course, we have all these variants we know about, there's sequence. This is a very well understood disease. And so we can just make a vaccine, and whether you decide you want the vaccine, not what have you. And I should say my wife and I both were fully vaccinated, and we got Delta anyway, despite taking precautions, et cetera. So be careful, everybody. Delta is out there. It is highly contagious. I know I'm recovering from it right now. And so please be careful. The bottom line, though, is that Alzheimer's is a disease where people don't understand. There's not a single virus. There's not a simple solution. As I'll show you, it's not a simple disease. It's fundamentally different. And therefore, even though there have been billions of dollars poured into these trials, there have been over 400 failed clinical trials. And most people would say that the aducanumab trials failed as well. One of them, everybody agrees it failed. In fact, it was worse than the placebo. But in the other trial, there was that question at one dose in one trial, it seemed like it might have had an effect. And interestingly, when people reviewed this, they said, well, there isn't anything else. Well, we've published multiple things that show people can, in fact, get better. So the problem is that the fundamental nature of Alzheimer's is what is unknown. And it sounds like the academicians who wrote to you still believe that we're not on the right track here. So we need a model that tells us what's actually going on so that we can predict what's going to work and what's not going to work. So that's what I'm going to show you today, as well as the First Survivors, as you mentioned earlier, just had a book that came out in the last few days, which is called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. 7 different people wrote about their stories and wrote about what it felt like to be told there was no hope and then to get better. So here's the fundamental problem. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the scientific background here. The fundamental problem is we as physicians have been trained to deal with simple illnesses like pneumococcal pneumonia, things where you write a prescription or you do surgery. So here's an example. If you're talking about people who have pneumococcal pneumonia, and this was a relatively common way to die 100 years ago, then in fact, if you have alcohol on board, that increases your risk. You don't fight it off as well. If you have diabetes mellitus, you have an increased risk. If your B cells, those are the ones on the humoral side, the ones that lead to the plasma cells that make the antibodies, then in fact, you also are at increased risk if they're not working well. And there are many other contributors. But as you can see, the single most important by far is the pneumococcus itself. And therefore, we as physicians have gotten away with, over the years, simply writing you a prescription that will treat the pneumococcus and ignoring all of these other contributors. Now, that's fine for a simple illness. It works pretty well. Here's the problem. We are virtually all now dying of complex chronic illnesses. And those include cancer and cardiovascular disease and renal failure and neurodegenerative diseases. And in fact, a professor from UCSF, Dr. Christine Yaffe, has shown just a couple of years ago that if you actually go autopsy by autopsy, that Alzheimer's is now the #3 leading cause of death in the United States. It's actually the #2 leading cause of death in the UK. So it's an incredibly common problem. So we want to know why that is and what we can do about it. Now, if you're developing Alzheimer's, and I'll get to the point that that's really a very late stage of a problem we can deal with much more easily in its earlier stages, then insulin resistance, and there are 80 million Americans who have insulin resistance, is an important contributor. It increases your risk. Pathogens, important contributors. So various things like herpes simplex from your lip and poor dentition, poor oral microbiome. So chronic sinusitis from various mold species and things like that. HHV6A, which is one of the herpes family of viruses. Leaky gut. There are all these different pathogens that can be contributors, and I'll show you why. NF-kappa B, anything that increases inflammation increases your risk. Exposure to mercury, and this has been known for years, and this is both organic and inorganic mercury. Various mycotoxins, so molds, some molds, make specific toxins, and it's especially big 5 molds. It's Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, ketomia, and wallemia. Those are the big five. And unfortunately, they're trying to fight for their own existence and what they have to do, because they live in a world where they are often outcompeted by bacteria, because the bacteria grow much faster. Of course, the molds have learned to make things like penicillin. That's where we got penicillin originally. But they also, unfortunately, make toxins that damage your brain, damage your immune system, damage your cardiovascular system, your kidneys, and on and on. And so, unfortunately, you can develop dementia related to mycotoxins, which unfortunately are typically not checked when you go in to say, hey, things aren't so great for my thinking right now. And then various organic toxins, and then homocysteine, and then on and on and on. And we initially identified 36 different what we call holes, and we know of a few more now. But the good news is there are not thousands of things, there are dozens of things, but you do need to evaluate those. So you can see immediately the problem. There's no prescription you can write for one thing here. It's not like pneumococcal pneumonia. So just addressing one thing, you might get lucky. It might be that rare person where that's the dominant thing. But most of the time, you're not going to get lucky, and the person will continue to decline. So no surprise then, when you look at these various drugs, then you see failure after failure after failure. And as an example, here's semaglutide. This came out from Eli Lilly several years ago. They spent over $500 million developing this. Not only did it not make Alzheimer's better, it actually makes it worse. So it's worse than taking water for Alzheimer's, unfortunately. And then we have here Dimebon. As you can see here, they didn't believe it when it failed the first time, so they actually did a second trial. The second trial was with a drug, and again, it failed again. So unfortunately, the problem is when you have a failure after failure after failure, what that's telling us is that something is wrong, with the way that we're thinking about this. We need to change our thinking. And of course, when we reorient our thinking, we change the frame of reference, which is the way many math problems are solved. You change the frame of reference, they're much easier to solve. The problem is, of course, everyone who's still at the old frame of reference thinks you're out of your mind and is trying to tell everybody that you're crazy and that you're not doing the right thing. So let's talk for a minute about the theories that are out there. The dominant theory over the last 35 years has been the so-called amyloid cascade hypothesis. And let me just say up front here, not a single one of these theories has led to an effective treatment. So that's the problem. If your theory is correct, it needs to be one that can be translated into actually helping human beings. And that hasn't happened with these others. So the idea is, let's get rid of the amyloid and people will get better. And of course, there have been several different amyloid drugs. They don't make people better. And so why is that, if that's really the problem? And as you'll see, it's a mediator. It's not the upstream cause. And therefore, you can actually do people harm when you get rid of it if you don't get rid of the upstream causes first. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Then there are other people who believe that everything is about tau. And again, tau is an important mediator, no question. And so drugs that lower tau may in fact be helpful in the long run as part of an overall approach. But doing that alone ignores what's actually causing this. And then my mentor, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Prusiner, who won the Nobel Prize in 1997, coined the term prion. And again, there's no question, both the beta amyloid and the tau function as prions, which means that they amplify themselves. But again, there's been nothing that showed that if you stop that you get rid of the disease. Type 3 diabetes, another common, chronic herpes simplex, an organism which is associated with poor dentition, which is called P. gingivalis. You find it in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. There's no question about that. So there's a whole company built around the idea that that's the cause of Alzheimer's. Again, they haven't gotten any results with making people better yet. Mercury toxicity, metal binding by amyloid, there have been trials on that. Reactive oxygen species, APP amplification, some beautiful, elegant lab work on that. But again, nothing leading to any sort of actual functional treatment. So again, we have to, however we come down, we have to understand, why do all these things seem to be theories of Alzheimer's. Why do they seem to be important in this disease? How can that be? How can this be a disease with all these different causes? What's actually going on? So here's the problem. If you go in today and you say, okay, I'm here for my memory loss or for problems with my cognition, then the doctor will tell you, well, there's a cause of Alzheimer's. We just don't know what it is. It's one disease. We call it Alzheimer's. There's a treatment. I'm going to write you a prescription, but it doesn't work very well. We're going to treat you with the same thing. When you get farther along, we might treat you with a different drug, but basically it's one thing, same thing for everybody, and it's ineffective, as we all know. In fact, a paper came out just a couple of years ago showing, very unfortunately, the people who went on the drugs, Aricept and Namenda are the two dominant ones, actually in the long run did worse, not better. So this is really tough. This is really, I think we're going to look back on this era. This is kind of barbaric, what we're doing. So the research findings suggest something very different, that there are multiple different contributors. As I said, we knew about 36 a few years ago. There are a few more, but it's not thousands. Therefore, no surprise, there are subtypes. There are people who have more of an inflammatory type of Alzheimer's, people who have more of an atrophic type, or a glycotoxic type, or a toxic, a biotoxic type, or a vascular type, or a traumatic type. These things can all contribute. And in fact, many people have a multiple of these that all contribute. Therefore, no big surprise, there are many different personalized programs. And just as personalized, so-called precision medicine is used effectively for cancer now, this is the way we need to do it for Alzheimer's. This is, again, a complex chronic illness. And I'll show you about how that works. So again, we're doing this the wrong way. Now, what we spent 30 years looking at is what actually drives the process. Why do you lose synapses? And I should say, there's a really interesting analogy to what has happened in COVID-19. So what happened with this pandemic? We knew late 2019, early 2020, that there was an insult to all of us, and that was SARS-CoV-2. And so we were told, shelter in place, social distancing, don't go to work, stay away. We downsized. We went into a protective downsizing mode because of an insult. And therefore, we went into a recession. And we're now having to recover from the recession and start rebuilding the infrastructure and these sorts of things. This is very similar to what happens in your brain when you're going toward Alzheimer's disease. You have these various insults, and we'll talk about which ones, but things like ongoing inflammation, pathogens, toxins, not enough energy, not enough blood flow, not enough oxygenation, not enough mitochondrial function. This is a beautiful, your brain is an amazing organ, and you have this beautiful plasticity network that is able to establish new connections or pull them apart. And so your brain switches to a protective downsizing mode. And if you look at the fundamental nature of this, you can look at a specific molecule called APP. This is amyloid precursor protein. And I should say some absolutely beautiful work on APP has come out of Australia. People like Dr. Ashley Bush have just done beautiful work on this molecule over the years. So this thing turns out to be very interesting because it is a sensor. So what happens is when things are good, and this is very much like a president or a prime minister or a CEO of a company, when things are good, the decision is, and I should say here, this is meant to be a membrane of a cell here. This molecule is in neurons and to a lesser extent in other cells. It's especially at the synapses of the cells. And when things are good, you have enough hormones and you have enough support, et cetera, this thing is cleaved at a single site, which is called the alpha site. And so essentially it's like your prime minister saying, okay, we're going now to let everybody know. So this is a memo that goes outside the cell. This one goes inside the cell saying things are good. We're going to make new synapses, maintain synapses. We're going to grow again, just like your country or a company. Now, when things are bad, then what happens is the opposite. So what happens in that case is it's cut at 3 alternative sites. And now what happens is you make 4 of these memos, these little peptides, 2 for inside the cell And this one actually, A beta, there's a little bit in the cell, but mostly outside the cell. And then this SAPP beta. So you can see here, this A beta is the dominant piece that's in the plaques, in the amyloid plaques. And so people have vilified that over the years and said, aha, that's the problem. Let's get rid of it. Well, it's not that simple. This is there because your brain has recognized insults, and it has now gone into a protective downsizing mode, again, just as our countries did during the pandemic. So what we have to do then is to say, why is it going into this side? Well, let's get rid of the problems and let's introduce the positive. Let's improve things. This leads to what's called synaptoclastic signaling. You're downsizing. It's literally like synaptoporosis. Many people know about osteoporosis, same idea. This is synaptoporosis. We want to go here on the synaptoblastic side, making and keeping new synapses. And by the way, people have looked at the brains in patients with Alzheimer's, and indeed, they have too much of this and not enough of this. So we want to change that. To do that, we want to know for each person, why did you go into that mode? For most people, it wasn't because of SARS-CoV-2, although, by the way, there's a concern about that in the future. It is maybe going to increase our risk for cognitive decline. But we know many things that already do that, starting with things like insulin resistance and sleep apnea and poor dentition and things like that. So what we want to measure for everybody is, why are you on the wrong side here? Or why are you at risk for being on the wrong side? And let's get you back on the right side again. So what we realized about 15 years ago is that these chronic illnesses are literally signaling imbalances. You're on the wrong side, you're on the bad side because of all the different things that you're doing, or your genetics, of course, are included in there. So osteoporosis, what happens is you've got cells called osteoblasts, you can see one right here, that make bone, and you've got other cells called osteoclasts. You can see that they're multinucleated. Here's one right here that actually chew up the bone. Now, when you're young, you're doing both of those. It's just like what you're constantly fixing your house. You're making a stronger and better house all the time. And that's what your osteoblasts and osteoclasts are doing, because they are balanced. But as you get older, as your hormones change, as your signaling, as your nutrition changes, as you get some degree of inflammation, then unfortunately, your osteoblastic signaling is outstripped by your osteoclastic signaling. And over years, you develop osteoporosis, unfortunately. Cancer, same idea, but in this case, you get mutations because you smoked too much, or because you got exposed to chemical carcinogens, or ate a bad diet, on and on and on. Now, in this case, you have a whole set of genes that are cytoblastic, making more cells, and they are now out of proportion to the activity of the cytoclastic, the ones that are turning your cells over. Same idea. So what we found in the laboratory over the years is that Alzheimer's is no different. There's a whole set of things that are synaptoblastic, as I just showed you going through APP. There's a whole set of things that are synaptoclastic. And unfortunately, as we age, many of us are too much on the wrong side of that balance. So we want to restore that balance. So this is just to show that an equation that basically shows you this is what we're dealing with. Your probability of getting Alzheimer's here. So this is probability of getting Alzheimer's is proportional to and integral over time. So it's saying we're integrating over your whole life. So this is over time. All of the sum of all these different things that create the synaptoclastic signaling that I just talked about, the inflammation, the pathogens, the toxins, all that, divided by all those things that are causing the synaptoblastic signaling. That's things like estradiol and testosterone and vitamin D. Again, many things, by the way, that were helpful for improving our outcomes in COVID-19. So if just looking at this signaling, that doesn't tell you like what lab tests do you order? How do you know what actually to do? Well, the good news is it's approximately equal to these four groups of things. Two groups that are on the bad side, two groups that are on the good side. So when they're too low, you have more cognitive decline. So one, and we can trace the molecular pathways, inflammatory mediators. When you activate inflammation, In fact, you increase your risk, and you can trace NF-kappa B. It enters the nucleus, it turns on a bunch of genes, and guess what? It turns on the genes that cut the APP on the bad side. So you can literally trace the molecular pathway to get this disease. And so same idea with toxins when you have exposure, and it's 3 different types of toxins. It's inorganics, unfortunately, things like being exposed to air pollution. And with, of course, the fires in Australia and the fires here in California, we've all had, unfortunately, an increase in our risk. So we've got to be careful. And then things like mercury, then organics, things like formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, glyphosate, all these sorts of things. And then thirdly, biotoxins, things like trichothecenes. These are things typically made by molds. Trichothecenes, gliotoxin, aflatoxin, things like this. Ochratoxin A, these are all those sorts of toxins. Now, similarly, energetics here, and again, I should mention, let me just go back to a minute to the inflammation. There's a similar problem when you get COVID-19 and when you get Alzheimer's disease. So when you get COVID-19, what has killed people? It's cytokine storm. So the problem is you have your innate system, that's your old part, the evolutionarily older part of your immune system. And this thing is kicking into gear and turning on inflammation. What you'd like to have happen is your adaptive system now comes along. That's the one that's more specific. It recognizes. It's the one that we're trying to boost up by giving ourselves the vaccines, of course. So you want to boost that. And one of the things it does is it turns down the innate system, and now it clears the virus. All good. The problem is when you're on the wrong side of this, you've got the innate system active, you die of cytokine storm, which is why we've had to tell people, let's damp this down. Well, in Alzheimer's, the same thing happens. You have a chronic activation of the innate system. The difference is instead of cytokine storm that's killing you, it's cytokine drizzle. This is a lower activation for years instead of a big activation all of a sudden. So therefore, we again want the adaptive system to be functional. The adaptive system's not doing very well because we're not in good health. We've got obesity, and we've got low vitamin D, and we've got low zinc, and we've got all of these various problems. So therefore, we want to get the adaptive system on. We want to turn off the innate system. Now, low energetics, that's 4 things. It's blood flow. So anyone who has vascular disease is at increased risk for Alzheimer's. It's oxygenation, people who have sleep apnea. The great news, there are wearables, simple wearables now you can look at, even a little oximeter on your finger. You can see if your oxygenation is dropping at night. If it is, you want to optimize that for better brain health. Third thing is mitochondrial function, and the 4th thing is ketones to burn, because what you see before you ever get Alzheimer's is a reduction in glucose utilization in your temporal and parietal lobes. And so, as Dr. Stephen Kinane showed a number of years ago, you can bridge that gap with ketosis, which is why we're so interested in getting some degree of ketosis. Now, you can cycle in, cycle out, that's great. What you want to be able to do is have what's called metabolic flexibility, where your brain can use ketones when it needs to, and it can use glucose when it needs to. The problem we all have is we're exposed to a high carbohydrate diet. So therefore, we now have the worst of both worlds. We're not making ketones, so we don't have those. And the glucose, we now have insulin resistance, so the glucose isn't used very well. So we've got a double whammy, and our brains are not getting the energetic support that they need, and they involute. And then the final thing here is trophic support. So trophic support, and I see we've got a couple raised hands. If you just give me a few minutes to finish up here, happy to take some questions at the end here. So please hang on for a few more minutes. So trophic support, and these are 3 things. This is growth factors, NGF, BDNF, things like that. It's hormones, as I mentioned earlier, pregnenolone, progesterone, testosterone, estradiol, all these sorts of things, thyroid, these all support brain function. And by the way, insulin is another one that supports brain function. And then the 3rd group is nutrients, vitamin D, vitamin B12, things like that. So this encapsulates the various things that actually are going to put you at risk. If we can optimize these 4 groups of things, we're going to get the best outcomes. What that means is the perfect Alzheimer's drug would look like this. And this is the problem. We spent years in the lab trying to develop an Alzheimer's drug. And so the fact of the matter is we're asking a lot. And I think in the long run, drugs are going to be very important when used on the backbone of an optimal precision medicine type of protocol, because these are all the things you have to do to get the best outcomes. So as mentioned earlier, we tell the patients it's like a roof with 36 holes. A drug is an excellent patch for one hole, but what about the other 35? So we want to combine these and address all these things. And in fact, we want to train new kinds of physicians. The traditional Chinese physicians knew about treating the whole body. They didn't know anything about DNA or RNA or things like that. The modern doctors, quite good with DNA and RNA and larger data sets and things like that, but they're not really good at treating the whole body. So we actually need to understand this. We need to treat this as if this is an entire system. So this is a systems biology type of approach where precision medicine is going after the things that are actually causing it. So functional medicine is something started by Dr. Jeffrey Bland about 25 years ago. And the idea there was, let's look at what's actually the root cause of these various illnesses. If someone comes in with hypertension, don't just write them a prescription for an antihypertensive. Let's find out why they have hypertension. And I should say, by the way, the people who have gone on our protocol, what they found is many of them have no longer needed their antihypertensives, they've no longer needed their anti-diabetes drugs, and they've no longer needed their statins because they're doing the right thing. They're addressing the things that are actually causing these problems. So it's lots of improved outcomes. And by the way, our daughter is one of these. She had early lupus years ago. It's now over 10 years ago. And we took her to two of the world's experts. My wife is a physician as well and was very concerned about her early lupus. We took her to two really outstanding physicians who basically said, yeah, she's got early lupus. There's nothing we can do. When she gets worse, we'll give her some steroids. So we thought, oh my gosh, why did she get this? And we finally took her to a functional medicine physician who said, yeah, I mean, I know what's going on here. She actually has a very leaky gut. She's spilling all these things into her bloodstream. She's got a reaction to it. Let's fix that. And sure enough, she fixed it. She got better, and she's not had a significant problem since. And in fact, interestingly, when she does the wrong thing, she gets a little touch back again. So we understand much better about what's going on. And we see this with improved outcomes in rheumatoid arthritis and metabolic syndrome and multiple sclerosis and cardiovasculars and just on and on and on. And unfortunately, it is not the standard of care. And in fact, the head of one of the major medical schools in the United States is an old friend and told me, you know, we'd love to teach this new kind of medicine in our medical school, but we can't do that until all doctors accept it. And of course, all doctors won't accept it until they teach it. So we're really kind of stuck in the 20th century with medical training, unfortunately. So we want to make this the standard of care. I mean, it's clearly getting better outcomes in many of these situations. And again, it's not necessary for everything, but for some of these complex chronic illnesses, including cognitive decline, and I think it's going to be helpful for many other neurodegenerative diseases. It's the best thing to do right now. So we proposed a proof of concept trial in which instead of you'd predetermine a treatment and say, okay, whoever comes in, we're all going to give them the same thing. We're doing it, we're flipping the script here and saying, let's look to see what actually is causing this problem. And that's what we did. So the goals here, so I want to just run through what do we need to do to get people on the right side. So energetics, as I mentioned, critical. We want to get people into mild ketosis. And at the beginning, it's easy to do that with just exogenous ketones. People take things like coconut oil or MCT oil or exogenous ketones, things like ketone salts or esters. Because I always see this as an emergency when people first come in. You're saying your brain does not have enough support. And really, the fundamental nature of Alzheimer's is an insufficiency. It's just that it's not a simple insufficiency like scurvy with vitamin C. It's a complex insufficiency of this plasticity network within your brain. Then we want to make people insulin sensitive. Once again, most people with Alzheimer's are insulin resistant. Trophic support, we want to get the growth factors, hormones, and nutrients up. We want to resolve their inflammation and prevent further inflammation. You know, people often say, oh, yeah, just take an anti-inflammatory. Well, wait a minute. You want to find out, why is the inflammation there? If there is a pathogen, that needs to be treated. If you're exposed to a mycotoxin, you need to quit your exposure to that. So yes, we want to resolve and prevent further inflammation, but we also want to find out why it's there. We want to treat the pathogens and optimize the microbiomes. That's one of the reasons this new book goes into, why did these people actually get it? And one of them, Julie, who wrote a beautiful story, talks about how she was actually going downhill after she'd improved. And I had talked to her and said, look, you need to get checked. You did not get some of the tests. And it turned out she had had exposure to babesia, which is a parasite that's a kind of a cousin of malaria. And when she got treated for her babesia, she did very well once again. Detoxification. So many of us exposed to various toxins that we need to address. Stimulation. It's interesting. People who've done the best have had some form of mild stimulation. It can be things like light stimulation, magnetic stimulation, brain training. So these have turned out to be helpful, a little bit like working out with weights as you're doing better with your nutrition. We want to, as I said earlier, improve the adaptive immune system. That's the specific one. We want to reduce the innate activation, the inflammation. And then after we do all that, that's when we want to lower the amyloid. The amyloid is there protecting you from something. So don't take it away until you take away the something that is causing it to be there. And then ultimately, we want to regenerate whatever has been lost. And that is where stem cells may come in, things like intranasal trophic factors and things like that. So again, I think we've got lots of things that can be done. We're told so often that there is nothing to be done. And I have to say, nothing could be further from the truth. There are tremendous numbers of things that can be done, and the earlier, the better. I hope that one day we will all be on active prevention. And if anyone misses that, then please go to active reversal as early as possible. When we've set up an app that you can actually collect all this information to remember to do all these things. So let me just show you a couple of examples. Here's Edward, who started December of 2013. He's one of the people who wrote a chapter for the new book. And you can see just dramatic improvements in his cognition here. His CVLT 2 Part B, way up here. His total recognition of hits here. So he went back after 2 years on the protocol and did very, very well. And actually the neuropsychologist who did these tests called me as we were driving, my wife and I were driving up from Los Angeles, and said, you've got to come see. He said, I've never seen this before in anyone who had Alzheimer's. And this guy had a positive amyloid PET scan. He's got ApoE4, which is the common gene that's associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's. And I should say, ApoE4, and I don't know how many people here have checked their ApoE status. In the past, we've been told, don't bother to check it because there's nothing you can do, which is absolutely wrong. People do check it now. It's important to know. If you have 0 copies, and that's about 3/4 of the population, then your risk for your lifetime, about 9%. If you have a single copy, and that's in the United States, somewhere around 75 million people, and most don't know it, your risk goes up to 30%. If you have 2 copies, it goes up well beyond 50%, depending some studies as high as 90%. So most likely you will get it. And that's 7 million Americans. So please, I recommend everybody, when you turn 45, or if you're already over 45, check it out and then see if you've got other risk factors, and you can address those things and you don't ever have to worry. And future generations should not worry about this problem. Here's Marcy, who's done very, very well. Here you can see improvement in her cognition, improvement in her hippocampal volume. She's done very, very well. So here's another guy, family history. This is actually a physician who called me when I first got to UCLA several years ago. A family history, both parents had died with dementia. He'd already had a PET scan that was markedly positive, typical for Alzheimer's. And you can see why he had it. He had a tremendous amount of inflammation here. His hsCRP, which should be less than 1, was almost 10. His homocysteine was high, should be less than 7. His vitamin D, which should be 50 to 80, was 21. And his testosterone, which should be up above 500, was 264. And you can see he responded beautifully. He actually came in, he's a brilliant doctor, and everything I would say to him, he'd say, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. So finally I said to him, look, give me 6 months. If I can't make you better in 6 months, then go somewhere else. He said, there is no other place. So he was kind of an irascible guy, but he's done very, very well. In fact, is now using the same sort of approach for his own patients. And you can see here, his hippocampal volume actually increased as he went on the protocol. So it's not just in our minds that he's getting better. His MRI is actually showing it. His gray matter here increased by 23%. We published a number of early papers on this. People complained that these are anecdotes. Well, yeah, in fact, we tried to do the first clinical trial on this comprehensive protocol in 2011 in Australia. And we were turned down by both the public and private IRBs. They said, this is you're trying to do multivariable protocol. You just need to do one thing. It's like drug or no drug, or vitamin or no vitamin. We said, well, that's not the way this disease works. So we never were able to do that trial. And we finally, after publishing over 100 different people who'd gotten better, we were finally able to do the trial here in the States in 2019. And I'll show you the results of that in just a second. So published a few books on this as we continue to make the protocol more and more effective. And we continue to learn. As you'll see, not every single person gets better. And the longer you wait, the tougher it is. So I've been very privileged and honored to work with three absolutely outstanding physicians, Dr. Anne Hathaway, Dr. Kat Toup, Dr. Deborah Gordon, and they're all trained in this protocol. They're all trained as functional medicine physicians, and they've all been getting good results with their patients anecdotally. Interestingly, when we talked about what to do for the control group, they said, well, it's unethical not to treat them because we've already seen people get better on this. How do we simply watch them go down the tubes? And that's something we're having to deal with. Now, it turned out the IRB would not allow us to do a control group for the first. They said you have to do a proof of concept first. If you can show that these people get better, then we'll allow you to do the next one. So now we're on, the next one is going to start early next year. We're still in planning stages, but I want to show you the results of the ones that we finished. And this is now public information. It's on medRxiv, the same place where a lot of the COVID-19 information is. So this is the first trial in history in which, instead of predetermining a treatment, which if you think about it really doesn't make a lot of sense. First, you want to look at the contributors for each person. So each person is going to get something that is targeted for their contributors. And this is registered with clinicaltrials.gov. As I mentioned, denied by the IRB in 2011. By the way, we were denied again in 2018, finally approved in 2019, and we posted this back in May. So it's a small proof of concept trial, 25 patients with MCI or early dementia. So actually very similar to the aducanumab trials in terms of where the patients were, how far along. This compares a personalized precision medicine protocol for over 9 months to historical outcomes from standard of care. What happened in all the many trials? We identified just the very contributors that I talked about a few minutes ago, things like pathogens, toxins, et cetera. And so we look at MoCA, which is Montreal Cognitive Assessment, at the beginning, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. We look at CNS vital signs because this is a more sensitive online test, also at 0, 3, 6, and 9 months. And then we look at AQ21. This is where your partner is saying, did the person get better or did they get worse? Because in some of these drug trials, although there might be a slight improvement, the partner can't tell anything. They can't tell who's on the control and who's on the drug. And then we have a thing where we look at the change over time. And then finally, we do the MRI with volumetrics, as I mentioned. So we do an MRI at the beginning, we do an MRI at the end. We look to see, do you have atrophy of the brain? Do you have improvement? Do you have no change, et cetera? So the CNS vital signs generates a number of factors. It looks at verbal memory. It looks at spatial memory. It looks at executive function. It looks at reading and all other sorts of things. But then it gives you an overall score called neurocognitive index. So you can see here, people started out lower. They improved at 3 months. They improved more at 6 months, and they improved a little more at 9 months. Now, what happened is the pandemic occurred in here. And you can see here, we got some people who actually went backward because of the pandemic. They stopped doing some of the things. But the good news is enough people did the right things that, in fact, this still ended up being higher on average than this. So you can see here their improvement over time. Now, again, this contrasts with the fact that with the drug trial, they still went downhill. So they're actually going in this direction, but they just went downhill a little more slowly. So as a summary, what we saw is that 76% of the patients improved their MoCA scores. That was statistically significant. The neurocognitive index improved in 84% of the patients. That was also statistically significant. The cognitive subtests improved, the verbal memory improved, the executive function improved, the psychomotor speed improved, the cognitive flexibility improved, and others as well. And again, you can read this all. This is all posted online. The AQ20 indicated improvement. So again, their partners noticed that they improved. Their brain HQ, their brain training scores improved in all of them. So as they did their brain training, they got better and better. And then perhaps most interestingly, their MRIs improved. So we looked at their gray matter and we looked at their hippocampal volume. A normal person, as you're aging, your gray matter is getting slightly smaller each year. If you have Alzheimer's, it's getting faster. It's going downhill faster. So you've got an accelerated decline. These people not only did better than the people with Alzheimer's, they did better than the people who are normal. So they didn't have that slight decline. They actually improved on their gray matter volume, a small amount, but it was actually an improvement. So they did better than normals for their same age, even though they had MCI or Alzheimer's. And the hippocampal volume declined less than. So now the hippocampal volume on this actually had a slight decline, but it was less than normal people for their age. So they did overall very well. So let me take 1 minute just to preach about the term mild cognitive impairment, because I think it's unfortunately, it was an unfortunate choice of words, and it has hurt all of us. Telling someone they have MCI, mild cognitive impairment, is like telling someone they have mildly metastatic cancer. It is a late stage of the problem. But doctors will say, oh, it's just mild cognitive impairment. Come back next year. You know, you're probably going to be okay. Maybe it's not going to be Alzheimer's. No, this is an emergency. So when you go through, when you're getting Alzheimer's, you basically have 20 years on average from the beginning of the biochemical changes, which you can pick up by PET scan or spinal fluid, until the point that you actually get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So the good news is we have a big window of opportunity, but you go through 4 stages. Stage 1 is where you're asymptomatic. So that really should be called pre-Alzheimer's. You've already got changes in your, in your spinal fluid and changes in your PET scan. Number 2, stage 2 is what we call SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. You know there's something wrong. Often your spouse knows there's something wrong, but you're still testing normally on cognitive tests. So your doctor says, yeah, you're still testing normally, you're fine. Well, actually, that's early Alzheimer's. And that's when you want to jump in. If you haven't gotten on prevention, please jump in when you have SCI. Virtually everybody with SCI can get better. And we see it again and again and again. That lasts about 10 years. So we have a tremendous window of opportunity. Please don't wait. The third of the 4 stages is MCI, mild cognitive impairment. What it should be called is advanced stage Alzheimer's. It's the third of 4 stages, and you don't want to wait. That's when you want to get in there. If you haven't done it before, please don't wait. So the people that we had in this trial were 2 groups. They were some people who had MCI, so the third of 4 stages, and then people who had, just a few who had full-on Alzheimer's. That's the 4th stage. And by definition, to have Alzheimer's, you have to begin to lose activities of daily living, like taking care of yourself. So you can see that's a very, very late stage. And yet again and again and again, we wait for that late stage. That is hurting everyone. So if people would just get in earlier, if everybody would get on prevention or early reversal, fantastic. So the goal of Alzheimer's trials, it's very important. Is the goal the best outcome or the best income? This drug right here is likely to sell about $500 billion. So you can see it's very tough to be unbiased when you're dealing with something that's going to make $500 billion. Here we have something with much, much better outcomes that's going to make far, far less than 1% of that. It's not a money-making proposition. It's simply the best we can do today to get better outcomes. And great, I hope in the long run, we'll have the best combination, which will include drugs. We are agnostic, whatever works to give the best outcomes. And of course, the most important thing is getting in early, getting on prevention or early reversal. Okay, I think we're almost on perfect timing here. So the trial, so the implications from this trial and where are we in the future? here's the thing. The bottom line is Alzheimer's is now optional. If ever, and I know that sounds crazy, if everyone would please get on prevention or earliest reversal, we can make this optional. We really could reduce the global burden of dementia. For people with MCI or early dementia, we can do very well. Now, for those who are really late, okay, that's much tougher. We're actually just setting up a trial for that to see with people who are, have MoCA scores of 0, because we know that we have anecdotal evidence that some of those people can improve, but we haven't seen anyone improve from 0 to perfect score of 30. We've seen people improve from 18 to 30, which is really striking. We've seen people go from 0 to 5, 6, 7. They can now dress themselves again. They can now speak again, things like that. And if anyone hasn't looked at Marama, I think it'd be wonderful to have Dr. Heather Sanderson on at some point, talk with her. She's the first one who's opened an assisted living facility, and she called it Marama, M-A-R-A-M-A. And she's doing the same sort of thing with her patients and was an early student. She's doing a great job, and she's seeing improvement, even in people who have had to go, who are all the way to assisted living. So typically they have full-on dementia. Again, we hope in the long run we get earlier on, but she's seeing improvements. Now, the other thing that came out of this trial is really interesting, that these people who didn't get better, the few, we could see why. One of them was living in a high mycotoxin home and just refused to change it and refused to leave. So the ones who have much lower scores, we don't know yet how much this will help. We know anecdotally we can see improvements. We need to have a separate trial. We might be able to make this even easier. Of course, we started with, there's nothing we can do for this, so we want to do everything possible. In the long run, of course, we want to make it easier and easier without losing the efficacy. So we're now going to go on to a larger trial. As I mentioned, we hope that we can adapt this for the unique chemistry of each of the different neurodegenerative diseases. And we have the first few people with macular degeneration who are starting something adapted to that chemistry. And so we combine all these different things. The fact that we can see this disease earlier, we can do something about it. It really says that Alzheimer's disease should finally be optional instead of unavoidable. So let me stop there. Just as for leprosy and other polio, things like that, Alzheimer's shall become a former scourge. It's a matter of time. And I think there's a tremendous amount we can all do to make this a former scourge.